He had built a world of glass and steel, untouchable, unshakable, unfeeling. But all it took to crack his perfect life was the trembling voice of a little girl on the other end of a phone call. "Please come fast. Mommy's lying on the floor." What began as an attempt to fire his maid turned into a journey that would unravel his arrogance, confront his emptiness, and introduce him to a love he never thought he deserved. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The skyline of Manhattan stood draped in the pale gold of morning light, glass towers gleaming like frozen fire. At the top of one such tower, the floor-to-ceiling windows of Damian Cole's penthouse office offered a sweeping view of the world he owned, or so he believed. Inside, the silence was thick and crisp, broken only by the soft ticking of a platinum desk clock and the occasional clack of expensive leather shoes against Italian marble. Damian stood near the window, black coffee in hand, eyes focused but detached. His tailored charcoal suit clung to him like armor, his expression unreadable, chiseled from habit and years of power. Behind him, the room was pristine. Not a pen out of place, not a smudge on the glass, not a breath of disorder. It was a shrine to control, and Damian was its high priest. A soft rustle at the far end of the penthouse marked the entrance of Monique Johnson. She moved quietly, as she always did, with the practiced care of someone used to being unseen. Her uniform was simple, dark slacks, white blouse, no jewelry. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun. She carried a small cart of cleaning supplies, her back slightly stiff, her face pale. Damian didn't turn. He didn't greet her. He never did. "Monique," he said without looking, voice flat and clipped. "The glass in the conference room had streaks yesterday. Fix it." "Yes, Mr. Cole," Monique said softly. He sipped his coffee. "And the floors, whoever waxed them last week missed the corner near the east wall." "I'll take care of it," she replied, eyes on the floor. That was how it went. Every morning. Commands. Corrections. A man who demanded perfection from the world, yet offered no empathy in return. Damian didn't know, or care, that Monique hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. That after leaving his penthouse, she would rush to her second job at a hotel, and then home to help her daughter with homework before falling asleep in a threadbare armchair, too tired to reach her bed. He didn't see the way her hands trembled slightly as she polished the glass, or how her eyes occasionally filled with unshed tears when she thought no one was looking. He didn't know that her husband, soon-to-be ex, had served her with papers just 2 days before. That he wanted full custody of Sophie and was using Monique's long work hours against her. That he had told her to leave their home by the end of the month. That her daughter was clinging to her tighter every night, whispering, "Don't let him take me, Mommy." Damian didn't ask. He never asked. He expected the room to be spotless, the air to smell faintly of citrus polish, and the people around him to exist only in function to his convenience. To him, Monique was not a woman, not a mother, not someone barely holding herself together. She was the maid, an entry on payroll, a person-shaped necessity, and she knew it. Still, Monique showed up every day, because she needed the job, because she needed the money, because she needed to prove to the court that she was stable, responsible, worthy of raising her daughter. That morning, as she vacuumed the edge of the office carpet, she bent down too quickly and winced, pressing a hand to her temple. A flash of dizziness swept over her, but she stood up straight, forcing herself to breathe. She couldn't afford to collapse. Not here. Not now. Not in front of him. Damian glanced briefly in her direction and frowned. "You missed a spot." Monique nodded without protest. "Yes, sir." He walked out a moment later, his footsteps vanishing into the echo of his wealth and detachment. Behind him, Monique gripped the edge of a table to keep from falling. The sun had barely risen when Damian Cole woke, as always, without the need for an alarm. His body obeyed the strict routines he'd carved into it over years of discipline and dominance. He rose, stretched his shoulders in front of the tall mirror, and stared at his reflection. Not out of vanity, but with the cold scrutiny of someone who believed emotions were inefficiencies best eliminated. Downstairs, his penthouse was unervingly silent. The floor sparkled, the glass walls gleamed, the countertops were free of dust or fingerprints. But one detail unsettled the rigid perfection of his morning. Monique was not there. He checked his Rolex, 7:05 a.m. She was never late. By 7:15, the irritation began to rise in his chest like heat trapped beneath his skin. He liked order. He demanded it. Deviations were threats to his equilibrium. He pressed a button on his phone. "Grace," he said when his assistant answered. "Is there a message from the cleaning service?" "Monique hasn't arrived." "None, Mr. Cole." "I'll check again." "No need." He disconnected the call before she could respond. Damien disliked being ignored. It wasn't about Monique. It was about principle. She was a paid employee. A no-show without notice was unprofessional and inexcusable. He scrolled through his directory, tapped on her contact, and dialed. It rang. Once. Twice. Then someone picked up. But it wasn't Monique. "Hello," a tiny voice answered, thin and trembling. Damien blinked. "Who is this?" A pause. A shaky breath. "My name is Sophie," the little girl whispered. His brow furrowed. "Where's Monique?" Silence. Then a sound that tightened something inside him. A soft sniffle, like a child trying not to cry. "Please, please come," the voice said again, smaller now. "Mommy is lying on the floor, and she won't wake up." Damien froze. The temperature in the room dropped. His hand, still holding the phone, lowered slowly. "Where are you?" he asked, the words escaping before he could think. I don't know the number, but it's our house. Mommy said, if something bad happened, call Mr. Damien." He stared at the phone in disbelief. Why would Monique ever? He moved fast. Back to his desk. Pulled up her employee file, fingers suddenly urgent against the keyboard. Her address was listed in a small apartment complex on the Lower East Side. Traffic blurred around him as he sped through the city in his black Maserati, his pulse louder than the engine. He didn't think about the meetings he was missing. He didn't think about the image he projected, about appearances or power or pride. All he could hear was the voice of that little girl. Mommy won't wake up. By the time he reached the building, he wasn't walking, he was running. Past broken mailboxes, up cracked stairs that smelled of stale hallway air and years of poverty. He reached apartment 3B and knocked hard, then harder. "Sophie," he called. The door creaked open. It wasn't locked. His stomach dropped. The apartment was dim and quiet. Old curtains blocked most of the light. He stepped in carefully. The smell of cleaning supplies still lingered. Habit, probably, even in her own home. Then he saw her. Monique, sprawled across the worn carpet in the living room. One arm bent awkwardly beneath her. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged with a blue so faint it looked like shadow. "Mommy!" Sophie cried, rushing to her side. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her curls were tangled, her pajamas too small, eyes red from crying. Damien moved toward them, knees hitting the ground as he checked Monique's pulse. Thank God there was one. Weak but there. He pulled out his phone. "This is Damien Cole. I need an ambulance to 428 Stanton Street, apartment 3B. Woman unconscious. Mid-30s. Breathing shallowly. Move fast." As he waited, he took off his jacket and laid it under Monique's head. Sophie clutched her mother's hand, sobbing into her shoulder. Damien looked down at the scene before him. This woman he'd never once seen, not truly. The maid. The cleaner. The woman who somehow held this tiny life together every day, even as her own was clearly falling apart. And he'd never noticed. Not once. The sirens came first, a rising wail that pierced through the morning quiet of the rundown neighborhood. Blue and red lights flashed against the peeling walls of apartment 3B as the EMTs arrived, moving quickly with practiced urgency. Damien stood back, holding Sophie close as the medics crowded around Monique's still body. "She's severely dehydrated," one said, checking her vitals. "Pulse is thready, but she's stable for now. The other was already preparing a saline for. Looks like total physical exhaustion. Probably hasn't eaten or rested properly in days. Damien clenched his jaw, standing at the edge of it all like an outsider. Which he was. A stranger in this story, one he should have known more about, but never cared to ask. As they loaded Monique onto the stretcher, Sophie clung to her mother's limp hand until one of the medics gently pried her away. "You'll have to ride separately," he told Damien. Damien nodded once. "We'll follow in my car." The ride to the hospital was quiet. Damien's Maserati, usually filled with the low thrum of classical music or silence, now carried a passenger in the back seat, a frightened little girl hugging her knees, her head resting against the cool window. Damien drove fast but cautiously, casting glances at her through the rearview mirror. She hadn't said a word since they'd left. When they arrived, he strode through the ER doors with Sophie in his arms. The nurses looked surprised, but didn't question it. Monique was rushed into emergency care. Damien, meanwhile, was directed to a waiting area, where he sat with Sophie on a stiff, squeaking bench. "Do you want some water?" he asked gently. She shook her head. He glanced down. Her sneakers were worn at the soles, her backpack, now clutched tightly in her lap, had a missing zipper. "Has this ever happened before?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes swimming with confusion and worry. "She gets really tired. Sometimes she falls asleep standing. But not like this." A beat passed before she added, "She works all the time. Even when she's sad." "Why is she sad?" Damien asked, careful with his voice. Sophie stared at the floor. "My daddy said she has to leave our house. He doesn't live with us anymore. He yells at her on the phone. I heard him say she'll lose me." Damien's throat tightened. He said nothing, because what was there to say? He had no words that would make sense to a child, and no excuse for not seeing the desperation in the woman who had quietly mopped his floors for over a year. The hours crawled by. Sophie eventually fell asleep with her head in Damien's lap. He sat motionless, staring at the blank television screen in the waiting room, while guilt bloomed like poison in his gut. When the doctor finally came out, he stood immediately. "She's awake," the doctor said. "Still weak, but stabilizing. She's going to need rest, real rest. Lots of fluids. She's malnourished and overstressed." This wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was emotional too. She's been on the brink for a while. "I want to see her," Damien said. "She asked for her daughter first," the doctor replied with a small smile. "You can both go in." Inside the small hospital room, the beeping of the monitor was steady. Monique looked like a ghost of herself, sunken cheeks, for in her arm, a hospital gown that dwarfed her small frame. But her eyes fluttered open the moment she heard the door creak. "Sophie," she whispered hoarsely. Sophie ran forward, tears already spilling down her cheeks. Damien stood in the doorway, a silent observer once more, but this time he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a witness to something sacred. "I'm sorry, baby," Monique murmured as she held her daughter tightly. "I'm so sorry." Damien stepped forward finally. Monique's eyes widened slightly when she saw him. "Mr. Cole," he gave a single nod. "You fainted." Sophie answered your phone. "I came." Monique looked away, humiliated. "I didn't mean for you to see me like this." "I didn't mean to never see you at all," he said quietly. Her eyes met his again, confused, guarded, tired. He cleared his throat. "You don't have to worry about your job. We'll talk later. But for now, just rest. I'll take care of everything." Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. Because how do you respond when the man who never looked twice at your pain is now promising to carry some of it? The hospital room had taken on the warm, dull quiet of mid-afternoon. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual rhythm, cars honking, people rushing, horns blaring, oblivious to the small, slow miracle happening in room 217. Monique sat propped up in bed, her skin still pale but slowly regaining color. Her hair, once tightly bound, fell loosely around her face in soft waves. The dark circles beneath her eyes had not faded, but the storm behind them had quieted. She sipped warm tea through a straw, cradling the paper cup with hands that still trembled ever so slightly. Across from her, Damian Cole sat in a stiff hospital chair. A black leather jacket hung carelessly over the back. He had never felt so unsure of where to put his hands. They were the hands of a man used to signing contracts, gripping steering wheels, adjusting cufflinks. Not sitting beside hospital beds, not waiting for small smiles of reassurance from women he barely knew. Sophie sat curled up in the corner chair, drawing on the back of a napkin with a blue pen Damian had fished from his pocket earlier. Occasionally, she looked up to check on her mother, but her face had begun to soften again, her trust slowly returning. "You didn't have to stay," Monique said finally, her voice still hoarse but stronger than the day before. Damian looked at her, startled by the vulnerability in her tone. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." A silence stretched between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that builds after too much noise has finally stopped. "You've been working 3 jobs," he said, more as a realization than a question. She nodded slowly. "I clean your penthouse in the mornings, the Waldorf in the evenings. On weekends, I do freelance laundry services." "Why?" he asked. It came out sharper than he intended. Monique didn't flinch. "Because I'm in the middle of a custody battle. My husband wants full custody of Sophie. Says I'm unstable. That I work too much, that I'm never home. But I have to work to have a home. It's a trap." Damian felt something twist in his chest. "Why didn't you say anything?" She tilted her head and gave a soft, tired laugh. "To who? My boss who barely said good morning? You paid me on time. That was all you owed me. Or at least that's what I thought." He absorbed her words like a blow, quiet, devastating. "I never asked," he said. "That was my failure." Monique glanced at him, and something flickered in her expression. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the space where forgiveness might grow. Sophie piped up suddenly, holding up her napkin like it was a masterpiece. "Look, I drew us." She ran over to show it. A stick figure drawing of 3 people. A tall man in a suit, a woman with curly hair, and a little girl holding both their hands. Damian stared at it for a long second. "That's very accurate," he said, managing a faint smile. "You don't look so grumpy in the picture," Sophie said matter-of-factly, then returned to her seat. Monique chuckled under her breath, coughing softly. "She's honest." "I can see that," Damian said, lips twitching. The hospital room didn't feel like a hospital anymore. It felt like a pause in the world, like a moment he had been too blind to see coming, and yet somehow exactly what he needed. "I read your resume yesterday," Damian said quietly. After Sophie called. "You studied literature?" Monique's face brightened for the first time. "Yes. I wanted to be a writer. I was working on a novel before. Well, life." "What kind?" "Historical fiction. I love the idea of giving voice to women who history forgot." Damian leaned forward. "Do you still write?" "I haven't in years," she admitted. The words dried up when the bills piled up. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the fire still burning quietly behind her tired eyes. Maybe it's time they came back. She didn't respond, but her gaze held his for a long moment. He stood. "I'll come back tomorrow." "You don't have to," she said again, a reflex of pride and protection. "I know," he repeated, "but I want to." As he turned to leave, Sophie ran to him again. "Wait." He looked down. "Can I draw you another picture tomorrow?" she asked. Damian smiled then, an honest, rare smile. "Only if I'm still not grumpy in that one." She nodded solemnly. "Okay, I'll make you even happier." And in that small, impossible moment, Damian Cole realized something he never thought he would. He wanted to be that man, the one who was happy in a child's drawing. The rain came in soft waves that morning, tapping gently against Damian's office windows. It was the kind of rain that made the city pause, slow down just enough for people to notice the sound of their own breathing. But inside Cole Enterprises, the storm had already broken. Damian stood at the edge of the boardroom table, a legal folder in hand, his team watching him with barely concealed surprise. He'd just cut short a high-stakes negotiation to take a personal call, unprecedented. He'd canceled 3 meetings in a row this week, unheard of. And now, he was making demands that had nothing to do with profits. I want full benefits extended to all part-time and custodial staff, Damien said without looking up from the folder. Effective immediately. A murmur swept through the room. One executive, a man in his 50s with a deep voice and thinning hair, cleared his throat. With respect, Damien, that would affect our quarterly projections. Not drastically, but… I'm not asking for a cost analysis, Damien interrupted. His voice wasn't raised, but it was sharp enough to cut the air. I'm telling you, make it happen. There was something in his tone, something quieter than anger but firmer than suggestion, that made the room fall silent. As the meeting ended, Grace, his longtime executive assistant, followed him back to his office. Are you all right? She asked, brows furrowed. I'm fine, he replied, loosening his tie. Just awake. Grace tilted her head, studying him for a moment. You've been different lately. He didn't respond, just nodded once and stepped into his office. Inside, on his desk, sat a small, folded napkin, the drawing Sophie had given him the day before. He'd brought it back from the hospital, smoothed the creases, and placed it under a glass paperweight. 3 stick figures. 3 hands held. A crude heart floating above their heads. He stared at it for a long time before picking up the phone. Monique awoke later that day in a quiet recovery room. Her body still ached, but it was a clean ache, one that came after the fall, not before it. She turned to find a nurse setting a tray beside her bed. You have a visitor, the nurse said with a knowing smile. And a delivery. Monique blinked. Delivery. The nurse stepped aside, revealing Damien walking in, carrying a sleek black laptop case in one hand and a simple bouquet of wildflowers in the other. His usual armor, suit, cufflinks, expensive coat, was gone. He wore a navy sweater and dark jeans, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. I didn't know your favorite flowers, he said awkwardly. So I asked Sophie. She said the little yellow ones that grow by the bus stop. Monique gave a soft laugh. Dandelions? He frowned. I tried. They're beautiful, she said, accepting the bouquet with care. He set the laptop case on the tray. And this is yours. She looked at it, puzzled. What is it? A laptop. Preloaded with writing software. I had your resume reviewed, your degree, your published college essays, your blog archives. You're a writer, Monique. Not just someone who used to write. She stared at him, stunned. Why are you doing this? Damien sat beside her, his gaze steady. Because I failed you. Because I had the power to notice you long before you collapsed. And I didn't. And because I'm trying to change. She looked down at her hands, voice trembling. You don't owe me anything. I know, he said gently. But maybe I want to be the kind of man who gives without owing. Her eyes welled with tears, and she looked away quickly. And there's more, he added. I hired a lawyer. One of the best family attorneys in the city. She's waiting for your call. She'll handle the custody battle. Monique gasped. Damien, I can't afford. I'm paying, he said. No strings. No conditions. You shouldn't have to fight alone. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. All the weight she'd carried, the fear, the exhaustion, the quiet panic, shifted, just enough for light to get through. Then came a knock at the door. It was Sophie, bouncing in with a juice box and a crayon-streaked notebook. Mommy, look what I drew today. Damien rose from his chair to let her pass, watching as mother and daughter wrapped themselves in each other again. As he turned to leave, Monique stopped him with a soft, broken whisper. Thank you. He paused in the doorway. Not just for the lawyer, she added. For seeing me. He nodded once, slow, deliberate. It won't be the last time. And with that, he left, not as a CEO trying to fix a problem, but as a man finally learning how to care. Monique's new apartment was modest but full of light. The living room had secondhand furniture, mismatched curtains, and walls the color of warm oatmeal. But it was theirs, hers and Sophie's. There were no bitter arguments echoing down the hallway, no looming court dates, no fear of eviction. The keys now hung on a lanyard by the door. She touched them every time she walked in, just to remind herself, We made it out. Books lined the shelf by the window, her books. Fiction, poetry, journals she hadn't opened in years. Her laptop sat on a small writing desk Damien had gifted her, beside a stack of printed short stories and a new planner filled with story ideas scribbled in pencil. At night, she wrote, not because she had to, but because the words had returned to her, as if they'd only been waiting for her to breathe again. And Damien had kept coming back. First with small gestures, a ride home from the hospital, a bag of groceries, a pair of sneakers for Sophie. Then with conversations. Long ones. He no longer came in suits and briefcases. He came in jeans and open collars. No assistant, no driver waiting downstairs. Just Damien. And more often than not, when he came, he stayed. One Friday evening, weeks after Monique had left the hospital, she opened the door to find Damien standing there holding takeout boxes. I cooked, he said dryly, holding up the containers from a nearby Italian bistro. Monique gave him a tired smile and stepped aside. How domestic of you. He smirked. I'm evolving. They sat on the floor, no formal dinner table yet, using a crate covered with a tablecloth as a makeshift dining surface. Sophie danced in and out of the room, narrating stories about school, showing Damien a wobbly tooth, and asking why broccoli was green and evil. He listened, amused and strangely attentive, offering exaggerated gasps and dad-like puns that made Sophie shriek with laughter. When Sophie finally went to bed, leaving the door cracked open, the room grew quieter, but not awkward. Monique leaned back against the couch. You're different now. Damien considered that. I think. I was just never anyone. I was a machine. You were still human, she said softly. Just asleep. He looked at her, eyes serious. You woke me up, Monique. Not by asking anything, but by surviving everything. I had no idea a person could carry so much and still smile at strangers. Monique turned away slightly, brushing her fingers against her mug of lukewarm tea. You don't have to make me into some inspirational parable. He shook his head. I'm not. I'm just recognizing the strength I ignored. They sat in silence again, the kind that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I used to think money could solve everything, Damien said eventually. But when I saw you lying there on the floor with your daughter begging for help, I realized I'd built a life that couldn't save a soul. Not even mine. Monique looked at him then, eyes soft but alert. And what are you building now? He smiled faintly. Something quieter. Something that sees people. Maybe even something that feels. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I wanted to show you this. She took it. Her eyes scanned the letterhead. It was an internal memo from Cole Enterprises. A revised policy. Expanded mental health benefits. Paid parental leave for all staff, including domestic and part-time workers. Tuition assistance for employees pursuing education. She looked up at him, stunned. You did this. I started it. It was overdue. I'm not fixing the world, but I'm fixing my corner of it. Monique didn't speak, but her throat tightened and her eyes brimmed. He reached for her hand, not boldly, not desperately, just gently, testing the space between them. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his. You know, she whispered, I used to think love had to come in grand gestures. Roses. Fireworks. Someone crashing through the door. But maybe it's this. He nodded. Maybe it's someone who listens when no one else does. Her head found his shoulder, and they sat like that, the glow from the kitchen light casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the city pulsed on, but in that room, time seemed to pause. For the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. The early evening sky shimmered with soft hues of gold and lavender as the sun began its descent beyond the city's skyline. Warm light spilled over the rooftops, painting the world in gentle strokes. On the 14th floor of a quiet apartment building tucked between a public library and a community garden, life was happening, not in dramatic declarations or grand finales, but in quiet, careful rhythms. Inside the apartment, the air smelled of cinnamon and roasted vegetables. Monique stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing an apron dusted with flour. Her hands moved with purpose, shaping dough, stirring sauces, smiling to herself as a timer buzzed on the oven. She was humming again. The dining table was still modest, hand-me-down chairs, chipped ceramic plates, a mason jar filled with wildflowers Sophie had picked from the park. But it was the kind of table people leaned into, the kind of table where truth could sit without shame. In the corner of the living room, Sophie twirled around with her handmade paper crown, holding a glittery plastic wand she'd bought from the dollar store. Her giggles echoed off the walls, filled with the kind of joy that came from security. Not material, but emotional. She'd seen her mother fall and rise. She had watched a cold man become warm. She had felt love grow around her like a new roof over a once shaky home. And then there was Damien. He arrived right on time, as always now, with sleeves rolled up and no entourage in sight. He carried a small box under his arm and a grocery bag in the other. Sophie squealed and rushed to the door to meet him. "I come bearing gifts," he declared, bowing exaggeratedly, as is custom when one enters the Queen's castle. "What is it?" she asked eagerly, already reaching. "First," he said, lifting the lid, "this is for you." Inside was a hardcover book, The Little Prince, its cover soft blue and silver embossed. "I figured every princess should have a philosopher's soul." Sophie hugged it like a stuffed animal. "Is it boring?" "Profoundly," he teased. "But by page 3, it's magic." "And the other gift?" she asked. Damien turned to Monique and pulled the second item from the bag. A small bottle of wine and a fresh baguette. "For you," he said, "to make tonight feel like France, even if we're just in Queens." She laughed, taking it from him. "France, huh? Should I prepare the Edith Piaf playlist?" "Already cued," he said, tapping his phone. They set the table together, moving in practiced harmony now. Damien handed her forks without asking. She knew he preferred his vegetables slightly undercooked. Sophie argued, as usual, that napkins were optional for royalty. No one corrected her. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. School updates, book ideas, the newest change at Cole Enterprises. A mentorship program for young women in lower-income neighborhoods. Monique had helped design the pilot curriculum. "You've become the heart of that place," Damien said to her, lifting his wine glass. She smiled, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "I'm just making sure no one else is ever overlooked the way I was." Sophie raised her juice box. To not overlooking people. They clinked glasses. Later, after dishes were washed and candles burned low, Sophie yawned and curled up on the couch. Damien carried her gently to her room, tucking her in like it was second nature. He lingered for a moment, brushing a kiss against her forehead. Monique stood by the doorway, arms folded loosely. "You're good with her." "I didn't know I could be," he said. "I didn't know I wanted to be." They moved back into the living room. The night was quiet now, the city softened by darkness. Damien sat beside her on the couch, their legs touching. "You ever wonder how we got here?" she asked. He turned toward her, his gaze steady. "Every single day." "I hated you at first," she admitted, her smile crooked. "You made me feel invisible." "I was," he said, voice low, "to everything and everyone." "And now," she whispered. "I see everything," he answered. "You. Her. Myself." She reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his. "You changed," she said. "No," he replied. "You changed me. You gave me the reason to become someone worth knowing." They sat there in silence for a long time, watching the lights flicker in the distance. No grand kiss, no swelling music, just stillness. Presence. Two people who had walked through fire, finally finding a place that felt like home. And when the sun rose the next morning, it found them there, still together, still healing, still whole. A new dawn. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.